Yes, y'all. Live and direct flight from JFK. Well, from Santo Domingo to JFK. Fabian PerspecTV, live and direct. What's going on? Just wanted to do a quick reaction to Once Upon a Time in Queens, man. I really enjoyed the documentary. It was cool. I was hoping it wouldn't be garbage. Just so happened that the Mets were getting whooped by St. Louis, possibly should be done for the season, but you never know. Um, it started off explaining how the Mets got into the documentary, that is Once Upon a Time in Queens, explained how the Mets were like a subpar team in the 60s. The Giants and Dodgers had left. A lot of the stuff I already knew, so that was cool. And then by the end of the 1960s, after playing some games in, I want to say Dodger Stadium, definitely in Uptown. Why is that still in my mind? The Polo Grounds, where Willie Mays used to play. They moved. They got the stadium, Shea Stadium. It was almost like a dump. It's Flushing. I'm from there, so it meant a lot to even see this on TV and everything. And then they get to how they were like just a bad team for years throughout the 60s up until the Tom Seaver 1969 championship. That was a great backstory. Um, because then it explains why it was so painful to lose Tom Seaver. Because growing up, I heard the name. You're a Mets fan, and it meant a lot because you knew he was the best pitcher on the team. And then just to lose him when they lose to the Orioles, who had a all-time pitching staff, it was like the moral victory. He had held the moral ground for the Mets. It led into the 70s when they traded him, and it seemed like all the Mets fans were just downtrodden. The Yankees win back-to-back 76, 77, I think they said. And 79, Keith Hernandez won with the Cardinals. And so I think they got into part two. After no, it started at the end of towards the end of part one. They were starting to build the team, and that's when they got into the general manager, Frank Cashen, who anytime I talk about teams, I usually point to the top. We always tend to focus on the players, right? Like LeBron, wherever he goes. There's an argument on Twitter all the time now that, oh, the Cavs really weren't that bad when LeBron left Cleveland or whatever. But it's like, no. In order to manage a bunch of personalities, entertaining personalities who are great at a sport, this guy Frank Cashen, who I never knew his name until this documentary, he was really good at that. I mean, he inspired Billy Beane, which I was hoping they would point to that as well. Billy Beane saw him when he came up from the minors, and he was totally inspired by him. And he was like, "Yo, that's what you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be that guy. Like he's the boss, kind of deal, right?" And eventually, Billy Beane becomes the Moneyball dude, right? He becomes the star of Moneyball. Meanwhile, they never touched on the fact that he was in the minor leagues with Darryl Strawberry. He says he saw Strawberry. He was the best thing he ever saw. But what he didn't speak on was that he knew from back then. The part of the Moneyball story is that Billy Bean knew that he looked the part, but Strawberry was actually the part. That he can actually hit the ball, and Billy Bean was like had a pretty swing, basically, for lack of a better term. Yeah, I don't know if he's a genius, Frank Cashen, but he traded for Keith Hernandez. And when he did let go, they got Tom Seaver back in 83 or 84 when Doc Gooden came up. That roster spot was open because they let go of Tom Seaver again. They reacquired Tom Seaver after trading him and then let him go. And the Mets, I guess, felt a shorter cut. The wound healed a little bit quicker this time because Doc Gooden comes up. And he's probably the best 2 years. Best 2 years for any pitcher of all time. He never reached that point again, nor the pitcher came out of the gate like Doc Gooden never did. And those were, he brought up Strawberry. He traded for Gary Carter. The same first year that Doc Gooden's first official year in the majors, he made an All-Star game and Gary Carter pitched for him. And that same summer, he traded for Gary Carter as the missing piece. Traded for Ray Knight, Kevin Mitchell. He drafted him. So it was this collection of players that eventually became the 86 Met championship team. But Frank Cashen was responsible for all of that. He's also responsible for hiring Davey Johnson, who Billy Bean referred to as ahead of his time. Not quite a genius, but ahead of his time, and some sort of mathematician. So I guess he was keeping score or something from analytics. And he's actually the guy who pushed Billy Bean to bring up Doc Gooden. So all this stuff is so fascinating to me. And of course, Strawberry story along with Doc Gooden. They didn't really get into Lenny Dykstra's story when he was younger, right? I don't even remember that. And I didn't take note of it. Yeah. And they just go into detail about Strawberry's background and Gooden's background. And they have their own, like, I don't know if it's a 30 for 30, but ESPN did a Darryl Strawberry, a Doc and Darryl hour and a half. I gotta watch that. They go more in depth into Doc Gooden and Darryl Strawberry's story. But they were the superstars of that team. You had the star pitcher and the star hitter. Strawberry just looked, they compared him to Ted Williams. And I forgot about Strawberry's swing. Like when I think about Ken Griffey Jr., I've seen his like top 50 plate stances of all time. And I forgot about Darryl Strawberry. I don't even think they had him on there. I'll add it on to the YouTube thing afterwards. It's in the description. They traded for Ron Darling as well, Frank Cashen. And the Mets basically represented the 80s, like what New York City looked like in the 1980s. It feels like it's similar to now. So this is almost, I'm hitting 40 years old next year. So the 1980s resembles what's going on now. They showed happening in the street. People with a lot of racial tension. Of course, the Central Park 5 happened later on in the decade. The gay and lesbian movement. I always thought Keith Hernandez was I just thought he was gay because of his mustache. I guess that's stereotypical, but I just always thought he was gay. And I'm surprised to know that he's not in the Hall of Fame. That's insane. Like, why the hell isn't Keith Hernandez 2 World Series championships? I think 3 MVPs, I'm not mistaken. But Keith Hernandez, for me, is the star of this documentary. Keith Hernandez is the star of Once Upon a Time in Queens. I gained even more respect for him, more so than ever. The way the team just outright respected him. From back then, you can tell they call him the pitching coach, hitting coach / player. He won an MVP in 1979, co-MVP with Willie Stargell. He won the championship with the St. Louis Cardinals, so he played with Ozzie Smith. That's the first question I would ask him was how, if I ever meet him, what was it like to play with Ozzie Smith, and also just his background, the complete opposite of Doc Gooden and Darryl Strawberry, where his father was in his life. And Doc and Darryl's fathers were also in their lives, but more abusive in Darryl's situation. And in Doc's situation, he was abusive as well. Right? And Doc's situation, yeah, he was abusive. And in Keith Hernandez's case, though, his father says that when he was 11 years old, he knew Keith Hernandez was going to had something. He didn't want him to waste it. So they had this footage from Keith Hernandez as an 11-year-old playing Little League. His mom being, like, the whole family's involved in his life. His little brother, he would call his little brother from the stadium because he didn't get along with his father after a while. And just sometimes you hear Keith Hernandez talk in the booth with Gary Cohen and Ron Darling, and he's just like, sucks his teeth. He snickers. He can get very disappointed in a player. And now that after watching this documentary, I feel like Keith Hernandez is like a father to everybody that he watches on that field. And he comes off so disappointed at them. Like, oh my God, that was the easiest play. Why would you do that? And it was just amazing. The plays that stand out was telling Bobby Ojeda in the, I don't even know why I say Ojeda. Nobody even dares to say Ojeda. He's a Latino Heat. They were in Houston. Bobby Ojeda in the game 6. I'll get to in a second because that was another series that stuck out to me. Game 6, he pitches a bunch of fastballs, and the Mets had just came back to take the lead. One of the wildest games of all time, 18 innings. Some people consider it one of the greatest games of all time. And the Houston Astros start coming back. And there was a pitcher at the meeting at the pitcher's mound, and Gary Carter, Keith Hernandez approached the pitcher's mound, and they're like, Gary Carter said something like, "Yo, just throw the fastball," something like that. And Keith Hernandez says, "You throw that fastball again, man, I'll kill you." Like, stop throwing fastballs. Ojeda throws 3 straight sliders to end the game. Throws his glove in the air. He said it never comes down. Well, that's when he won the championship. That was amazing. That really stood out to me. The World Series, I think, was always famous because of, Mookie Wilson and the Mookie Wilson ground ball through Bill Buckner. I had already knew that part. Bill Buckner he was injured and stuff like that. Like, I knew that part about the legacy of it. But I didn't know that they were supposed to take him out, and they always replaced Bill Buckner. And they did touch on how Bill Buckner used to play for the Cubs, if I'm not mistaken. So he was in the National League, and he recognized Mookie Wilson's speed. So that's what kind of like put him under pressure as well for, to get the ball, but his legs are so hurt. It's the last out to make, and he couldn't make it. They took out Roger Clemens in the 8th, who ends up. No, is that game set? That's game. It's game 6 in Shea Stadium. They end up going to extra innings. Is that when it happened? Now I'm getting confused. It was, because they were. Oh, that's game 7. I'm sorry, it was game 7. Roger Clemens pitched. No, it couldn't be. I'm bugging now. But I think it is game 6. Roger Clemens shaves in the 10th inning. So this all happened in the 10th inning, right? Bottom of the 10th. Roger Clemens shaves, has time to go to the back and shave. Keith Hernandez said he looked up to the Jumbotron, and he saw Roger Clemens had a clean shaven face. He's like, wait a minute, he's never that clean shaven. So he said he was getting ready to celebrate and wanted to get ready for the cameras. Uh, Dave Henderson catches the ball the second out of the inning and does like a little freeze frame statue pose, and they got kind of get worked up off that. Gary Carter says is up, the first man up with 2 hours left. He goes, "Ain't no way I'm going to end the game. Be the last out in the World Series." Next guy was Ray Knight. Ain't no way I'm gonna be the last guy in the World Series. I think Kevin Mitchell. No, I think Kevin Mitchell was up next, and then that's the Mookie Wilson play happened. But you could watch all that. You could YouTube all that. I really enjoyed it. They got in depth with a lot of things that I just like. Those things, the small details of the game to the World Series, it was cool, but nothing was as interesting to me as the Houston Astros series, the NLCS. Totally overlooked unless they're talking about like cheaters throughout the history of baseball and of sports. Mike Scott, who I've never heard of before in my life, Mike Scott ends up becoming like one of the most feared pitchers of all time. And Nolan Ryan is in the same pitching staff. Like, these guys have an amazing pitching staff. Oh, the Astros do. He ends up going like 20-10 that year, 1986. Mike Scott was drafted by the Mets, so he came up with the Mets. The Mets got rid of him because he wasn't all that. I don't know if he went to a different team, but he ends up going to Houston. And when he's in Houston, his first year, it's bad. He's still not good. He ends up in the 1985 offseason hooking up with this guy, Roger Craig, who I had the name was so memorable because I thought it was an error that they made, because I'm thinking of Roger Craig from the San Francisco 49ers. Roger Craig, I do a deep dive into this. Roger Craig ends up is the pitching coach to the Detroit Tigers, who won this championship in 1985. After turning around their pitching staff. Their pitching staff had like a ridiculously bad ERA. Casey Stengel, right? That's his name, Casey Stengel, from the Detroit Tigers. I got that right? Real quick, Detroit Tigers. No, I'm sorry, Sparky Anderson. There's one of them names that are famous from back in the day. Sparky Anderson ends up, he talks about Roger Craig being one of the best. He's going to be a great coach in the future. Watch, you'll see. Mike Scott, who's struggling with the Mets, struggled with the Houston Astros, ends up visiting Roger Craig in the 1985 offseason, and then develops a split finger. So the split finger is what Roger Craig is teaching all of these new pitchers in throughout the early 80s, mid to late 80s. So much so that all of these pupils that he had to end up teaching other pitchers, and now you have like one pitcher per each team by the end of the 1980s that has learned the split finger fastball. And apparently in the 90s and 2000s, the split finger ends up injuring the pitcher too much or way too soon, so they kind of like stave off of it. But it was birthed in the night. It was born or birthed out of or branched off of the fork ball. So it's supposed to be like when they spread your two fingers. That's why it's called a split finger splitter. A little wider than the usual on a fastball. And the crazier part is Mike Scott learns this split finger from Roger Craig, and all of a sudden becomes unbeatable, better than Nolan Ryan, apparently, who's pitching in the same series, by the way. Another crazy pitching staff. The Red Sox one was pretty good as well. The Keith Hernandez points out, and a bunch of players point out on the Mets, a lot of these balls that are coming up are scuffed. Scuffed, I've heard the term before. I didn't realize what they do, how they actually do it. But apparently the pitcher has like sandpaper and they're rubbing the sandpaper on the ball. So they showed him doing that a bunch of times. I read an article where Keith Hernandez said, they asked him, like, how do you know he's scuffing the ball? He's like, well, they don't always play at home. So when they play over here with us, the ball got to go into, when they hit it to the outfield, they hit it wherever, it has to land. When they hit it to the outfield in a foul ball, the ball has to land somewhere, and we pick it up, and we collect them all. So that's been an infamous game, an infamous moment throughout history. It's also one of many moments throughout history, throughout the baseball legacy, that has to do with cheating. There are so many instances that have to do with cheating. And Mike Scott, they asked him if he scuffs the ball, and he was like, I mean, I don't know necessarily if I scuffed the ball. I may have thrown a scuff ball, but I don't know if I scuffed them. It was like, what? Mike Scott. Mike the Scammer Scott. Knock it off. Does he live in baseball infamy? I guess so. But I don't really know, because even with the steroid scandal, even with the Houston Astros scandal, now from, what is that, 21 years later or 31 years later, in 2017, Houston is still cheating. So hitting the top of garbage cans and stuff. I think a lot. And you think he's the only one? You think that the split finger was learned by just splitting your finger? There was no sandpaper involved by any other player throughout the 1980s. I just found that really interesting as well. Like the 80s, just starting off with the split finger, and that's how the pitchers improved. And it ends with that becoming so popular. It's like, yo, what's next? Well, steroids. Anyway, I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to do like a real short segment about it. Hope I didn't bore you. I didn't bore myself, so I know I didn't bore you. But signing off. Hope you guys respond, have some questions, go back and forth about it. I just bought Jay Horowitz's book. He's the New York Mets. Guess he's like a PR dude. He wrote a book like last year. I think, in 2020. And he was having a book signing somewhere. I don't think I'm going to go to the book signing. But I definitely wanted to check that out. He's been around since 1980. Jewish dude, grew up in Jersey, ends up being a PR guy for the New York Mets. I'll tell you how that is when I'm done, after I take my notes. But signing off. See y'all later.